Good morning, colleagues, and thank you, Prof. Riri, for that introduction. I trust all is going well with the orientation, and I'm joining you virtually, but across the street from where you may be, if you within the venue at Ocean Sciences. But greetings to all of you, whether in person at the venue or virtually. As indicated, for the next 30 minutes or so, the intention is to provide an overview of one of the many policies that underpins your journey within both your master's or your doctoral program. I'm sure, and I reflected on the program and saw that within this morning session, you would have had an overview of the faculty administration. So please forgive where there may be some overlap with some of the information that may have already been shared by one of the previous presenters. I trust that my slides are visible to all of you, and on my little screen I can see that it's projecting on the main screen at Ocean Sciences. So I'm going to proceed and perhaps ask Prof. Meloriri to just interject if for some reason I'm losing connection or the slides are not visible. So as an introduction, as in many institutions, policies, guidelines form a basis in terms of framing the manner in which the implementation of not only the institutions, but also the faculty's vision and strategic goals may be aligned to the way in which services are provided. And so when we reflect on this policy that we're going to spend a few minutes sharing about, we take note that this is a policy that has been in practice within this institution for many years, and it was initiated and implemented as of January 2006. And like we all have experienced over this past 2 years and even further than that, that changes occur all of the time. And so as we reflect on changes and the changing landscape, especially within postgraduate education in not only health sciences, but also in higher education, policies also need to be revised and are amended accordingly. And so in like manner, this particular policy has gone through 2, if not 3 iterations of revisions to make it more robust, to make it more agile, and to speak towards the vision of the institution. And so it forms a guide regarding the manner in which postgraduate studies, in particular at a master's and doctoral level, is administered. And I want to emphasize that, like with all policy documents, we always reflect on it and read through it in conjunction with other guiding documents. And in particular for us, within the faculty and the university, I wish to underscore that as a postgraduate student, you may be a new student that is registered in this year for the first time, or maybe registered for the first time within our institution, or also a student who has been registered for a while, but needs to be, this is always an opportunity to revise our understanding and framing some of the reference points within our postgraduate studies. And so I want to just underscore the use of not only the faculty prospectus, but also the university general rules, which is also another document, all of which is available within the student portal of the institution. So that takes me to how do we find this policy? How do we locate it? As indicated, and I've just put some screenshots of the page that you may all be very familiar with. If you log on to, and often you can set it as a default setting, onto whichever operating system or browser that you're using, when you log on to the student portal, you would be presented with a page that looks something like this. I've tested it on the student portal, so while mine says staff, this top dashboard or banner would more or less reflect the same. And as you navigate through the page, you will find a icon that looks something like this, and that's where the policies are. And then when you proceed into that, you are then able to look through some of the policies. These may be different for a student portal, but within it, there would be a reflection of the research policies. And then within that, under postgraduate degrees, is this policy on master's and doctoral degrees. And I'm sure that through our colleagues, a copy of this policy can also be downloaded and made more easily available to the students. So when it's downloaded, it looks, this is the cover page of the document. And as I've indicated, you can take note of, this just gives you an indication to share the, mostly the robust conversations and dialogues that have occurred in framing and in endorsing the policy as well as revisions to that. So there are the general guidelines that underpins this policy as well as the application of it it speaks to all processes or all activities that is inherent from right through from your admission or your application process, your admission, selection, registration, right through to your examination and your completion or graduation of your respective degrees. And so you will find that within the policy, there are various sections that speaks to each of these. And I think important to take note of is that all decisions and the implementation of this policy or application of various aspects of the policy is not made in silo or made by a particular individual, but rather is supported through various reporting structures. And I try to emphasize this within the little diagram that's, or figure that's reflected towards your right-hand side of the screen. So right through from registration, and I think emphasizing this point also takes into account why often it may seem like, why is there so much of paperwork? Why is there so much of forms to be completed or processes that I need to go through? Or you may hear your colleague or supervisor, if you would be allocated to a supervisor by now, share about particular committees that still need to approve a particular decision. And this is where it's reflected. And so all decisions first starts with yourself and your team, your core team, that's housed mostly within the department within which you are registered. And within that core team, most likely your first point of communication or reference would be with your supervisor. But as Ms. Africano would have already shared, you also have a direct link with the faculty administration as well. And so as decisions are made, they vetted, they discussed in accordance with the policy, because the policy underscores efforts towards access and efforts towards progression or completion of your respective qualification within a particular period of time. So when decisions are made, when discussions are formed around certain aspects, this is the principles that are used within that. And often from a departmental level, which is then endorsed by the head of school or the head of department and the director of school, it then is escalated to the faculty level. And I'm not going to belabor the point because as I share, I'm sure this would have already, the structure would have been shared in one of the first few presentations. One of the acronyms that's often spoken about is a faculty postgraduate studies committee, often called FPGSC as its abbreviation. And this is where, as Prof. Melariri, as the acting chairperson of the committee, would communicate with, through monthly meetings, with the representatives from each department in respect to the manner in which the policy is being adhered to in terms of registration right through to examination of postgraduate studies. So this becomes the committee where most of the decisions around M&Ds or masters and doctorals occurs. But within the faculty structure is also a faculty management committee, and often or sometimes in special cases or where it's needed to be discussed in conjunction with other heads of departments or heads of departments and directors of schools, it occurs in there. And then the policy also makes reference to an institutional committee. So this is when faculties come to a decision, but it needs to perhaps for certain reasons be ratified by a further committee. This occurs at an institutional level, and the DVC for research, innovation and internationalization, Dr. Ngwebi, facilitates and chairs these committees, which is abbreviated as PGSC. So in a nutshell, this just shares with you the reporting structures. And I think it's also to share the confidence within which the care is taken in coming to a resolution, and that the resolutions that are formed around postgraduate studies are always aligned towards a student-centered approach. And while being aligned to the policy, it's always towards looking at opportunities for access and towards promotion for progression or completion of your respective qualifications. It's almost impossible to reflect on the entire document, but safe to say that it's as I've indicated, it's a document that includes these respective areas. And there are 3 critical touch points in your master's and doctoral journey that are particularly emphasized in the policy. The one, as I've indicated, is around admission, registration, and then continuation of your registration or termination matters. And that's reflected on section 4 of the policy. And I know that today or over the next 2 days, you may be receiving information overload. And so these slides and the information reflected in this presentation is going to be shared through Ms. Moton, but also wherever you find yourself, you can also just take certain notes down that allows you then to reflect further as you engage and read deeper on the policy. The second aspect that is important is around supervisory relationships that the policy gives reference to and guidelines in terms of how to administer that process. And this is inclusive of areas around complaints or grievances, and that's reflected in sections 5 and 7. And that's the sections that I would like to spend some time on this morning. Other areas within the policy that's also important to take note of, wherever you find yourself in your postgrad journey, is around the examination processes or the procedures. So what occurs after you've come through the point of completing your research report, and now it's ready for vetting and review by other experts within the field. And so what occurs in that examination process and procedure. And that's reflected in section 6. And then almost 50% of the policy is made up of annexures or exemplars. And that's towards the latter part of the policy. And I really encourage you to spend some time reflecting and going through these useful annexures. And that's from, as I've indicated, from page 35 towards the end of the document. So now that you are a registered student and a member of our faculty as a postgraduate student, what are some of the critical things to take note of? I think, you know, in presenting today's presentation, I reflected on some of the most commonly occurring requests that are presented either to the department or either to the faculty committee, as I shared, known as FPGSC. And one of the most frequently occurring one is around completion within the required time. As you would know better, the decision around starting a postgraduate qualification, and as it comes with much reflection, not only of your own career and personal trajectory, often you reflect on it in relation to where you find yourself, either in terms of your employment or even in terms of your family structure, your own personal goals, etc. And so you would have planned to undertake this particular milestone in your personal journey for a particular period of time. And so in like manner, institutions, nationally and internationally, also have the same premise of completion of a qualification within a certain time. And this is for various reasons. But within research, I think it is important to underscore the most important reason is that research, and especially on certain topics, is also time dependent. And so whether it is for a coursework qualification where you're undertaking certain modules, you would also appreciate that the healthcare system is changing every day. And so in order for us to be aligned to one of our graduate competencies, which is around fit for purpose, this also echoes this need towards ensuring that completion of postgraduate studies occur within a certain amount of time. And as we know, with ethics and with research, that work that has been started and commenced, or information that has been collected on a particular topic, those experiences, expressions, numbers, a profiling of a certain disease or a particular healthcare problem also evolves. And so the need towards completing within a required amount of time is also beneficial for you as a scholar or a soon-to-be expert within this field to ensure that the work that is being produced is also relevant and current. And so these are certain of the indicators that are used in determining how long is given as a boundary for completion of respective qualifications. And so, as reflected on the slide, depending on whether you are registered as a full-time student, and the policy also makes reference to how it defines a full-time student or a part-time student, there are these, the maximum period of time that is awarded for you to complete that. And so if it is a master's qualification, it is 3 years if you are full-time, or 4 years if you are a part-time student. And if it's a doctoral degree, then you are awarded a maximum of 4 years as a full-time student and 6 years as a part-time student. And this is important, especially if you have just commenced your journey, to reflect on what are some of the critical steps that needs to be completed. So in your planning, in your Gantt chart that you would reflect on, to be able to be mindful of this. And that's important because once that maximum period of study, and your supervisor would also, through progress reports, and the heads of departments would also be taking note of monitoring and evaluating progress, so that we ensure that we also being compliant to this particular policy clause. And so what happens when a student finds themselves in a situation for various reasons, exceeding that normal maximum years of study, and would need to continue with their respective studies. And so there's a process that occurs. And that's what I would like to also just emphasize, that it occurs in consultation with your supervisory team, it's then vetted, as I've shared in the previous slide, departmentally. Each department has their respective research committees where they would robustly engage on what has been the motivation provided for the need for extension of study period, what has been the progress. And so often supervisors, as well as the academic team in the department, will reflect on looking at your progress reports that has been submitted over your years of study, in terms of what progress has been made. And then it is then escalated with motivation. So only when it's supported by the department, through the head of department and through the director of school, then it is shared within the faculty postgraduate studies committee. And the faculty postgraduate studies committee can deliberate and make a resolution in terms of whether to approve or to approve with certain conditions, or not to approve, up to a request for an additional year of extension of study period. But in some cases where you find that it is now the, the second additional year that is requested as extension of study period, then those decisions again moves through that same line of communication from the supervisory team to the departmental committee, the faculty committee, but then it is then needed to be shared with the institutional committee. And so the DVC and that committee at the institution, which is represented by faculty representations from the entire university, then would engage with the documents that's shared in terms of what's the reasons for non-completion within the maximum duration of study. And so I'm especially belaboring this point because often we read, we find that that this is, as I've indicated, the most occurring request that comes through from students, and we do not negate that personal challenges occur. Some of the traumas that have been experienced, not only with COVID, but with many other challenges, has also been expressed in some of the motivations that we have seen within the faculty. And thus far, as I've indicated, a very student-orientated approach is used in reflecting on the reason for extension of study period. But it's also important to consistently communicate, to consistently keep a progress report. And that forms the evidence of also reflecting that while I may have had a hiccup now for certain reasons, this also demonstrates my journey and where I've come from. And that's also important to take note of. Other important aspects that is reflected within the policy is in terms of what is the process that you would need to follow. And here Ms. Africana would share or would have already shared some of the forms that is required. And also to take note that when a request is made for extension of study period, it needs to occur in the preceding year. So if a person knows that 2023, 2022 is their maximum year, but they can already start engaging by now August, that I may not be able to meet the deadline for graduation or submission in December, then by November, that application needs to come through to the faculty. So again, just emphasizing open communication with your supervisory team. And then other aspects within this section 4 that's important to take note of is in terms of what is the process of continuing with your registration. And then in some instances, policy takes note that there may be some unique, out of the usual or normal circumstances where a student needs to put their studies on hold, which is referred to as abeyance. And so this just allows for a candidate to just be still with their studies for whatever personal reasons. And so there's a process of applying for your studies to be in abeyance. What's important to take note of is that now that you've commenced your journey as a postgraduate student, from the first day of your registration, whether registration lapses in a particular year, so a student, what we refer to as a non-returning student, does not present in that year for registration, or your studies in abeyance, it is still added, or it's still counted as that academic year. So in terms of the years for completion, with a proviso. So when it comes to a potential maximum time for completion, that will still be taken into account in terms of what was the reason for abeyance. But just to take note that it is still a year that it's your years one still starts with your first year of registration. The second aspect that I think is important to take note of is Section 5, which speaks to supervision and progression, or supervision and progress. This section speaks to aspects around how supervisors and co-supervisors are allocated to students. What are some of the principles? What are some of the requirements in order to be a supervisor or to be a co-supervisor? And why it's important for you to take note of this is that often as a postgraduate student, you may have been invited to do a doctoral study or a master's study by a colleague that you know, either through your undergraduate program or through research engagement. And so when you register, you may then find that you joined on the team with a co-supervisor or an additional external supervisor is brought onto the team. And you may be finding yourself in a situation, but why can't I have that person, or why can't I have that person on my own? And this is the principles that's used. And so in Section 5, there's discussions in terms of the appointment of supervisors. So that's 5.1.2, and it speaks to some of the requirements that's inherent in being a supervisor at both a master's and at a doctoral level. It also speaks to the roles, responsibilities, and expectations. And I think this is really important because as you would be engaging with your supervisor, you would be already familiar with a supervisory contract or an agreement that speaks to a tailored approach between you and your supervisory team in terms of how often you're going to meet, what's the modes of meeting, how long after a submission of a document is reading time required before a meeting can be scheduled to discuss what has been submitted. And so all of this forms the contract or the agreement between yourself and your supervisory team. But it also in this section speaks to some of the roles and responsibilities and the expectations of both us as an adult learner, as a postgraduate student, and also us as the supervisory team. And so that it doesn't lead to that last bullet, or it areas to mitigate us coming to the point of where unexpected or expectations or sometimes unsaid expectations are discussed. And this is where you will find that it may lead to complaints or grievances. But when such occurs, there's also a process in terms of how this is managed. And then lastly, what's important to take note of is the use of external supervisors. And these may be external supervisors who are external by virtue of the name from the institution. And these may be all external from the faculty. And these may be for various reasons, most of which is towards expertise. And so as we move towards a time in health sciences and in higher education where we're putting effort into understanding the transdisciplinarity of our fields and the manner in which our work is cross-cutting with other professions and with other disciplines, we're starting to see more and more the need for external supervision. And so this process then just allows us to just emphasize norms between faculties where external supervisors are brought in. Very lastly, I just want to emphasize in this section around progression is a section around the submission and the approval of research proposals. This is, as indicated, been in the policy for a number of iterations and years. And gradually, the institution is adopting mechanisms to monitor and evaluate this particular aspect of the policy. And what it indicates is that by a particular time of registration, a proposal needs to be approved or presented and approved within the department and within the faculty. And so I just want to emphasize this point, and so that's reflected on 5.1.5 of this policy. It indicates that within 6 months of registration as a master's candidate or student, and then within 12 months of registration as a doctoral candidate, there's an expectation that the proposal is approved. And so this again just highlights for you to take note of in terms of your planning. So just as concluding comments, and as I've shared, it's not very easy to unpack the robustness of such a comprehensive policy within a short amount of time as we have this morning. But just to emphasize some of the key areas, but to also encourage you to take note of the policy, try and download it, have it readily available, because you will find that you will utilize it, as well as your supervisory team will be utilizing it through various aspects of your journey. Use it as a point of, it's a resource, and so use it as a point when you're needing to consult and to verify. Often, you may be wondering, what do I do next? What happens if this, if a particular situation occurs? And I found that navigating through this policy over the past few years, that it speaks to almost all possible situations, and where it may be silent on new situations that could occur. This is where the departmental process and the faculty process is there to guide us. Use it as well as a premise for your own planning, and I hope that by now you would have had a session or would be having a session on just how to navigate and plan your steps in your journey, and the importance of charting your progress. And so use some of these indicators as milestones and also as critical points in terms of monitoring your own progression as your own yardstick. And then to utilize the resources in consultation with the faculty administration. And so I find that the faculty administration office, through the leadership of Ms. Africana, is always available to share how we can navigate through certain aspects of our postgraduate journey. And then lastly, it's about communication. Just asking, starting from your supervisory team, but asking anyone within the departmental research committee structure, your head of department, and then also through the faculty administration. Communication just allows you then to better navigate through this journey. And then lastly, just to wish you well, and to use this as a resource that guides you, and to also allow you to reflect on what's just on the horizon, and that's the process of examination towards completion and graduation of your respective qualifications. Thank you so much. And I've seen through Birthland that I've utilized all of my time, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to stay on board for a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Naidoo, for that detailed presentation. I'm sure the students and staff could feel really that we are really willing to engage with them and pour out, much of what we have to assist them. Thank you so much for that. Is there any questions from online delegates? Do we have any questions? Please, could you indicate by raising your virtual hand? We'll be able to entertain not more than 2 questions because of our time. Is there any questions? Okay, I see there's a hand up. What's the name?
Good morning, it's Richard Brain. Can you hear me?
Riberen. Okay, so that's one question. I think that's the only question we have. And from the floor, I don't think there's any question from us. Okay, Riberen, please go ahead and ask your question.
Good morning, Professor. My name is Richard Barain. I just want to know the difference in the roles between the supervisor and the co-supervisor, and what happens if you have a problem with your co-supervisor and you just don't get on. What happens then in that case? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think, so let me start with the first part of the question. So the roles between a supervisor and a co-supervisor. The roles are different. In most cases, you will find that a supervisor takes on a more leading role. And a co-supervisor is brought on for various reasons. Could be in terms of as part of the academic profile of the institution. It's an opportunity for an academic to also get involved in postgraduate research supervision. And so a co-supervisor may be brought on in that capacity. In some instances, and I myself find myself sometimes in those spaces where I come on as a co-supervisor to complement a particular aspect of that study. So it may be, and I'm going to speak to the PhD process because it yields, or the outcome yields a product that is maybe different to a full research master's. You may find that a co-supervisor is brought on, whether it's for methodological expertise, whether it's in particular for a specific area of that study. So the supervisor primarily anchors that supervisory process and takes on that leading role. And so that's within the institutional policy. But you do also find that departments, and this is the importance of departmental research committees, they often also, depending on the department's research, strategic planning, their own plans, will also bring on the role of co-supervisors differently, and so as a mentoring role. And so it's important for you, in whichever department you find yourself in, to at the outset to understand, I'm a student and I'm presented with, I have a supervisor and sometimes up to two co-supervisors. What is our roles and how do we navigate this? And that's why the use of a supervision agreement or a contract is important. And then where you do find yourself, the second part, where you do find yourself in a situation where it's not pleasant any longer, or it may just need an opportunity for dialogue and discussion where unmet needs are being experienced. I would advise you to start, if you can't with your supervisory team, then through the head of department. And then the document then does spell out processes for that communication.